On May 1st, 1920, Stockholm woke to grim news. Crown Princess Margaret of Sweden was dead, while carrying her sixth child. Just weeks earlier, she had appeared in public, cheeks lightly flushed, offering the gentle smile the world adored. But anyone looking closely would have seen it. The faint shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor at the corners of her mouth, as if she were holding on to strength, to dignity. The press called her the English Rose, the woman who had brought the warmth of an English spring into the cold palaces of the north. But that rose had withered, quietly, far from home. Did she die from illness, from fate, or from the slow, relentless erosion of royal duty? The answer lies in the story you're about to hear. Not just of a princess, but of the human cost of a crown. Margaret, Victoria Charlotte. Augusta Nora was born on January 15, 1882, at Bagshot Park in Surrey, England, a winter child wrapped in layers of wool and privilege. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the living emblem of an empire at its height, and the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. From her very first breath, Margaret's life was charted not by her own dreams, but by the steady hand of royal expectation. The world she entered was a gilded one, but gilded things can be cold. Bagshot Park stood proud among frost-bitten fields and leafless oaks, its stately corridors echoing with the click of boots and the rustle of uniforms. The nursery was bright with winter light, but even here, the air carried the weight of protocol. A nursemaid might smile, but never forget to curtsy. A governess might tell a story, but always in the approved moral tone. Margaret was an observant child, quick with questions, quicker with smiles. She loved colors, music, and the sound of the wind rattling the old windows of the palace. She had her father's height, her mother's fine features, and an energy that, if she had been born outside the royal sphere, might have carried her anywhere she wished. But in the Windsor and Hohenzollern bloodlines, energy was not meant to roam free. It was meant to be disciplined, shaped, and, when necessary, silenced. Even as a little girl, she understood that her life was less about who she was and more about what she represented. A granddaughter of Queen Victoria was not simply a child. She was a symbol. She was a thread in the great tapestry of dynastic diplomacy, to be woven wherever the crown deemed necessary. The family's love for her was real, but it was the kind of love that lived within boundaries. Her father, Prince Arthur, was a career soldier, duty-driven, punctual, and deeply conscious of the royal image. Her mother, Princess Louise Margaret, was German-born and carried with her the disciplined formality of the Prussian court. Together, they ensured that their daughter's upbringing would be impeccable. Lessons in languages, history, literature, and the intricate rituals of court life. Margaret excelled in her studies, but she also had a mischievous streak. In private moments, she would escape into the gardens, slipping past the flower beds to the farthest corners of the estate. There, beyond the manicured lawns, the tall iron gates loomed, locked, always locked. She would peer through the bars at the world outside, wondering what lay beyond the reach of royal schedules and ceremonial duties. Those gates became, in her mind, a quiet metaphor for her life. The beauty within, the freedom without. In public, she bloomed like the rose the press would later name her. She was warm, gracious, and had a gift for making even the most nervous courtier feel at ease. Her smile was as much a skill as it was an expression, practiced to perfection, yet not without sincerity. Foreign dignitaries found her charming. Family friends remarked on her kindness. But to maintain this charm was itself a form of labor, one she would shoulder for decades. By the time she reached her late teens, her role in the royal chessboard of Europe was already being discussed in private. She was not merely a beloved granddaughter, she was a potential bride for any number of princes across the continent. The late Victorian and Edwardian eras were still an age when royal marriages were matters of state, designed to knit nations together, or to secure alliances that could prevent war. Margaret, for her part, dreamed quietly of love. She sketched flowers in the margins of her letters, hummed songs to herself in the palace corridors, and devoured novels that spoke of loyalty and affection. But reality pressed in with every passing year. Her heart would never be entirely her own to give. And yet, there was a spirit in her that resisted despair. In her early 20s, she began to travel more, attending state events across Britain and the continent. She saw the grand halls of Berlin, the glittering salons of Paris, and the bustling streets of Rome. These journeys widened her view of the world, but they also deepened her awareness of how small her personal freedom truly was. Wherever she went, she was trailed by attendants, bound to schedules, and hemmed in by unspoken rules. The court photographers adored her. She had a natural ease before the camera, her head held high, her gaze steady but never cold. The papers wrote of her poise, her elegance, her English rose complexion. But photographs do not record the quiet moments, the times when she would return to her rooms after a long day of ceremonies, sit by the window and stare out into the dark gardens, letting her face relax into its true, unguarded form. She was intelligent enough to understand the duality of her existence, adored in public, constrained in private. And though she rarely spoke of it, she carried the knowledge that her life was not truly her own. It was a service, lifelong, unyielding, and without escape. Family gatherings at Windsor brought her some comfort. She was close to her siblings and cousins, and there was laughter at those long tables, warmth in the candlelit halls. But even there, the undercurrent of duty ran strong. Every conversation seemed to bend toward the same topics: alliances, obligations, appearances. In such an atmosphere, love was an indulgence, personal happiness a luxury. By the dawn of the 20th century, Margaret was entering the age when marriage would no longer be a matter of speculation, but of decision. And as with so many princesses before her, the choice would not be hers. She was a valuable piece in the royal game, a bridge between nations waiting to be placed. In the gardens of Bagshot Park, the seasons turned. The roses bloomed and withered, the great gates rusted a little more each year. Margaret still walked those paths, still paused before the iron bars, still looked out at the world beyond. She was admired. She was loved. She was prepared for the role she had been born to play. But even then, in the soft English light, there must have been moments when she wondered what price she would pay for it. The English rose was in full bloom, but roses, no matter how carefully tended, do not last forever. In 1905, the world was changing. But for a princess of Margaret's rank, some things never changed at all. The British Empire was at its zenith. Yet Europe was a web of fragile alliances, each thread held in place by diplomacy and by marriage. Royal unions were less about romance than about maps, treaties, and the balance of power. Margaret was 23 when the decision was made. She would marry Gustav Adolf, Crown Prince of Sweden, the future King Gustav VI Adolf. On paper, it was a perfect match. The granddaughter of Queen Victoria, wedded to the heir of a constitutional monarchy in the north. Britain and Sweden, bound by blood, would enjoy closer ties. To the public, the announcement was romantic enough, an English rose carried off to a Nordic throne. The newspapers printed her portrait beside his, framing them as a fairy tale couple. The reality was more calculated. The match was proposed and negotiated between families and advisors, the final arrangement sealed with handshakes and protocol. Still, Margaret approached her new role with grace. She had been raised for this, trained for the demands of statecraft. If she felt the sting of a life chosen for her, she did not show it. On June 15, 1905, in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, she walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, embroidered with silver and crowned with a tiara of diamonds. Her smile was luminous, her posture perfect, her composure unshakable. But outside, the sky was a pale, indifferent gray, and a cold wind threaded through the castle grounds. Photographers caught the moment they emerged, Margaret's veil billowing in the wind, Gustav Adolf's gloved hand resting formally over hers. It was a wedding of nations, not merely of two people. Within months, she was installed in the Swedish royal court, a world both familiar and foreign. The palaces were grand but severe, their interiors less ornate than the warm richness of Windsor. The formality was stricter here, the traditions more rigid. The air inside the marble halls seemed colder, the silences longer. The climate was not only literal. The Swedish court was conservative, its rhythms shaped by an older, more restrained culture. The British court, for all its rules, had moments of wit and lightness. The Swedish court prized reserve and duty above all else. Margaret's vivacity, so natural in England, had to be carefully measured here. Every word was weighed, every gesture was observed. Her new husband was dutiful, conscientious, and polite. In public, they presented a united front. In private, the distance between them was harder to bridge. Gustav Adolf was a man of his time and station, focused on duty, tradition, and the production of heirs. Theirs was not an unkind marriage, but nor was it one of shared dreams whispered in the dark. From the start, the unspoken expectation loomed. She must bear children, ideally sons. The line of succession depended on it. Within a year of their wedding, Margaret gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Ingrid. 2 years later came a son, Gustav Adolf. The court celebrated, the nation applauded, but each pregnancy left its mark. Royal motherhood in the early 20th century was not the romantic vision painted in portraits. It was a physically taxing, emotionally isolating role. Margaret's health began to ebb with each birth. Yet she was still expected to fulfill her public duties, ceremonies, charity events, state banquets, always impeccably dressed, always smiling. Letters to her family in England hint at the strain. She wrote of missing home, of feeling the weight of constant scrutiny, of the cold both inside and outside the palace walls. But such confessions were always brief, sandwiched between polite updates and reassurances. A princess was not supposed to dwell on her own discomfort. Her position as a foreign princess in Sweden was complex. To the public, she was admired. Her elegance and charitable work earned genuine affection. But within the court, she was still the English one, an outsider in traditions that stretched back centuries. Even her successes were sometimes met with polite reserve from those who believed the role of crown princess should be filled by someone truly Swedish. The cultural differences were subtle but relentless. In England, she had been surrounded by family. In Sweden, she was separated by sea and politics. Her father and mother visited when possible, but the First World War would soon make travel nearly impossible. Even before the war, visits were formal affairs, not the easy comforts of home. Margaret adapted as best she could. She mastered Swedish, oversaw charitable projects, and became a visible patron of the arts. Yet behind the carefully composed photographs and public appearances, Her life was a constant negotiation between her own nature and the expectations of her role. There's a photograph from these early years. Margaret in a white gown, standing beside Gustav Adolf on a palace balcony. The crowd below is blurred, waving flags. The sunlight catches in her hair. To the casual viewer, it is a perfect image of royal happiness. But look closer, and her eyes seem focused on something distant. Beyond the crowd, beyond the city, perhaps beyond Sweden itself. Marriage had given her a crown in waiting, but it had also placed her inside yet another set of gates. They were invisible this time, but no less real than the iron bars she had gazed through as a child. She had stepped into her role with dignity, carrying with her the grace and training of her upbringing. Yet already, the path ahead was narrowing. Every decision, from the number of children she would bear to the tone of her voice in council, was bounded by the will of others. And though the English rose still bloomed in the public eye, her roots were now in colder soil. The chill of the north was not only in the air, it was in the silences between words, in the absence of the familiar, in the knowledge that her life's course had been set long before she could steer it herself. From the outside, it was everything a royal marriage should be. A young crown princess, radiant in her role, producing a growing family that promised stability for the Swedish throne. Between 1906 and 1916, Margaret gave birth to 5 children, 2 daughters and 3 sons. Each arrival was marked by formal announcements, celebratory gun salutes, and photographs in which she cradled the newborn, smiling serenely for the camera. But the truth beneath the lace and velvet was far more complex. Pregnancy after pregnancy took a toll on her body. The fatigue was constant, the recovery slow. There were whispers among her ladies-in-waiting that she sometimes wept alone in her chambers, not from lack of love for her children, but from the relentless strain of bearing them under the unblinking eye of the court. Medical care in the early 20th century could do little to ease the physical burden. Postpartum depression was not yet a term in common use. It was called melancholy, nerves, or simply dismissed as a woman's weakness. And for a royal mother, there was no space to admit such feelings. Not to her husband, not to her family back in England, not to the court physicians. Margaret carried on as she had been trained to do, by moving forward, fulfilling her duties, and presenting an unshakable image to the public. She appeared at military parades just weeks after giving birth, sat through hours-long council banquets with a carefully composed expression, and stood for portraits even when her back ached and her head swam. The expectations extended far beyond the nursery. She was required to oversee charitable projects, patronize the arts, attend diplomatic receptions, and accompany Gustav Adolf to official visits across the country. The Swedish people loved her for it. She was seen as warm, approachable, and genuinely interested in their lives. But every handshake, every polite smile, every perfectly chosen word was an act of endurance. In letters to her sister Patricia, she sometimes allowed the mask to slip. One note, preserved in the family archives, contains a telling line. "It is a strange thing to feel so surrounded and yet so very alone." The words are brief, almost casual, but they speak of a loneliness that the pageantry could not hide. The rhythm of her life became a cycle. Pregnancy, recovery, public duty, and the next pregnancy. By the time her youngest son was born in 1916, Margaret was 34, and her health was no longer what it had been. She began to experience lingering fatigue, frequent headaches, and recurring ear and sinus infections. The doctors recommended rest, but rest, for a crown princess, was a luxury rarely granted. And yet, she loved her children fiercely. Those who knew her well spoke of the warmth she showed them in private moments, the way she would sit on the nursery floor, reading stories or helping them with puzzles, her formal manner giving way to genuine laughter. But even these moments were carefully rationed by the demands of her schedule. There were always more audiences to grant, more ceremonies to attend, more duties to fulfill. The weight of expectation was not only physical, it was generational. In the eyes of the court, Margaret's primary purpose was to secure the succession. A healthy line of heirs was the foundation of the monarchy's stability. Her identity as a woman, a wife, and even as a mother was inextricably tied to the political health of the dynasty. There is a photograph from these years. Margaret in a tailored coat and wide-brimmed hat, holding her youngest child in her arms. Her smile is polite, almost flawless, but the eyes tell a quieter truth. The slight narrowing, the distant gaze, the hint of fatigue. It is the look of someone performing joy for the benefit of others, while her own reserves are steadily draining. Over time, those closest to her began to notice the small signs of strain. She stood a little less straight after long ceremonies. Her voice carried a faint rasp by the end of public engagements. She developed a habit of pressing her hand lightly against her temple as if warding off an ache. And still, the duties continued, unbroken, unaltered, unrelenting. By the end of the decade, Europe was in turmoil. The First World War had redrawn borders and shattered illusions of stability. Even neutral Sweden felt the strain, economically, politically, socially. For Margaret, the war years meant fewer visits from her English family, greater isolation, and an even heavier reliance on her public role to maintain unity at home. In those years, the English rose still bloomed in the public imagination, but her petals were thinning. Each season brought new demands, each year another layer of exhaustion. Motherhood had brought her love and pride, but also confinement of a different kind. The nursery, the public stage, the private chambers. They were all part of the same enclosure. The same gates she had glimpsed through as a child at Bagshot Park, only now, she was not looking out. She was looking inward, wondering how long she could keep walking the narrow path set for her. The English rose was still standing, but the stem was beginning to bend. In the eyes of the Swedish people, Crown Princess Margaret was a success. Her charity work was visible. Her command of the language improved with every year. Her visits to schools, hospitals, and rural communities brought warmth to places where the monarchy had once felt distant. Newspapers praised her grace and spoke of her as a bridge between Sweden and Britain. But inside the palace, the reality was more complicated. She was still, in many ways, an outsider. The Swedish royal court had centuries of traditions, unwritten rules, and quiet hierarchies. Margaret, for all her charm and effort, remained the English one, foreign in her habits, her humor, even in her manner of addressing the staff. Some of the older courtiers saw her as a guest rather than a future queen. The war years deepened that sense of separation. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Sweden declared neutrality, but the political climate grew tense. For Margaret, it meant a severing of the most important lifeline she had: regular travel to Britain. Her father and siblings remained in England. Visits became rare and heavily restricted. Letters took weeks to arrive, and sometimes longer to receive a reply. In 1917, both her parents fell ill. She could not be at their side. The distance became more than physical. It was a constant ache, a reminder that in moments of personal crisis, the crown came first, and her role in Sweden could not be set aside. Margaret poured herself into charity work during the war. She organized relief efforts, raised funds for food distribution, and supported hospitals caring for the sick and wounded. Photographs show her in a plain coat and hat, handing out loaves of bread to mothers and children. But even this work, noble as it was, stirred friction within the palace. Some in the aristocracy viewed her efforts with suspicion, disliking her modern, hands-on approach. A princess, in their eyes, should oversee from a distance, not roll up her sleeves. They muttered about English methods and questioned whether such public appearances were becoming of a crown princess. One story from this time lingers. At a food distribution event, as Margaret smiled and offered bread to a line of women, a group of noble women stood nearby, watching. Their expressions were cool, their voices hushed but pointed. Whether she heard their words or only felt their judgment, Margaret's smile never faltered. But later, back within the palace walls, she was said to have sat in her private rooms for hours, speaking to no one. The isolation was subtle but constant. It wasn't open hostility. It was the quiet exclusion that comes from not belonging entirely to the world around you. She had learned Swedish customs, celebrated Swedish holidays, dressed in Swedish styles, but in the most private gatherings, when the old court families closed ranks, she was still on the outside. And yet, she continued to fulfill her role with precision. Publicly, she was every inch the future queen, poised, capable, and dutiful. Privately, she was a woman balancing two identities, each incomplete without the other, and each leaving her somehow unmoored. Her children were growing, Ingrid now a poised young girl, the boys boisterous and full of energy. They were her greatest comfort. But the demands of court life meant that even motherhood was often mediated by nannies and formal schedules. She loved them fiercely, yet saw less of them than she wished. It was in these years that the English rose began to fade in a way no newspaper would record. Not from scandal or public failing, but from the slow erosion of belonging. She was rooted in a country that admired her, and a court that did not fully claim her. There is an image, unofficial, taken by a photographer from a distance, of Margaret walking alone in the palace gardens one winter morning. Snow covers the ground, her dark coat drawn tight against the wind. Behind her, the palace looms, its windows shuttered. She is turned slightly toward the camera, her expression unreadable. It is the portrait of a woman who has given herself entirely to her role, and yet remains, in some essential way, apart from it. The English rose still stood in the public square, but in the quiet corridors of the palace, she walked alone. By 1920, Margaret was 38 years old. In an era when medical science had not yet given the world antibiotics, when maternal mortality was still a shadow that hung over every birth. Another pregnancy carried risks that even the healthiest women could not ignore. For a royal mother who had already endured 5 pregnancies in 14 years, and whose health had never fully recovered, the danger was real. And yet, the expectation remained. The Swedish royal family's succession was secure on paper, but tradition valued not only heirs, but a broad line of descendants. A 6th child would strengthen the dynasty and perhaps produce another son to reinforce the future of the monarchy. The decision was not Margaret's alone. It was embedded in the structure she served, in the polite but unyielding conversations about duty and legacy. When news quietly spread through the court that the crown princess was with child again, the official statements were warm, congratulatory. In private, among those who knew her well, there was concern. Some recalled how pale she had been after her last confinement, how slowly her strength had returned. Others remembered the cough that had lingered through the winter, the days she had been forced to cancel public appearances with fatigue. Still, Margaret did what she had always done. She met the moment with resolve. That spring, she continued her public schedule, attending ceremonies, greeting dignitaries, and appearing at charity events. Photographs from this time show her in elegant coats, gloves clasped neatly, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. At first glance, she appears as she always had, composed, dignified. But if you look closely, the signs are there. The careful way she stands, one hand resting on her midsection, the faint tightness in her smile, the way her gaze sometimes drops, as if calculating the distance to the nearest chair. Friends urged her to rest. The doctors, bound by the discretion of the royal household, offered guarded advice. But rest was elusive in the life she lived. The expectations of her role did not pause for pregnancy. She still attended official openings, garden parties, and receptions, occasions where her absence would be noted, whispered about, perhaps even criticized. Margaret understood the optics of her position. A crown princess withdrawing too much from public life could invite speculation, not just about her health, but about the monarchy's stability. And so, she kept moving forward, each engagement another step along a path she could not turn away from. One photograph from April 1920 captures the contradiction. She stands on the steps of a public building, dressed in pale fabric that catches the sunlight. A small bouquet rests in her gloved hands. Around her, officials smile. The crowd waves. She smiles back. But the eyes, so often described as warm and bright, are shadowed. The skin beneath them faintly bruised by exhaustion. It is the look of a woman who knows the cost of what is being asked of her, and has decided to pay it anyway. Her letters to family in England during this time are sparse, and those that survive are brief, formal, and without complaint. Whether this was her choice or the result of the court's careful control of correspondence is unknown. But silence, too, can speak. By late April, the whispers in the palace grew quieter, replaced by a different kind of watchfulness. Servants noticed she moved more slowly, that she retired earlier in the evenings. There were days when she was not seen outside her apartments at all. Still, the public saw her at a handful of engagements, standing tall, smiling for the press, one hand resting gently over the life growing inside her. If she feared the risks, she never admitted it aloud. She had been raised to see personal sacrifice as the natural price of service. It was the way of her family, the way of her class, the way of her world. But in the quiet hours, behind the closed doors of her rooms in the palace, she must have felt the weight of the crown, of the expectations, of the 6 small lives she had carried, one of them still within her. The English rose had weathered many winters in the north. But this spring, the air was colder than it should have been, and the sky seemed heavy with something unspoken. The petals were still open, but the stem was bending lower. It began quietly, a discomfort in the ear, the kind that most people would dismiss. But in late April of 1920, discomfort turned into pain, sharp, deep, unrelenting. Margaret had been preparing for another public appearance when the first wave hit. She paused in the middle of dressing, pressing her hand to her head, waiting for the ache to pass. It didn't. By evening, the pain had spread, a throbbing in her skull that made the light seem too bright, the air too loud. She excused herself early, retreating to her rooms. Within days, she had a fever. The palace physicians diagnosed otitis media, An infection of the middle ear, common enough in children but far more dangerous in adults, especially pregnant women. In another time, our time, antibiotics might have ended it. But in 1920, there was nothing that could stop the infection once it began its advance. The pain intensified. Fever climbed. Her appetite disappeared. Servants were told to keep the corridors quiet. But even the faint creak of the floorboards seemed to reach her with the force of a hammer. She stopped attending meals, stopped reading letters, stopped smiling for anyone but her children. And even then, only faintly. By the final week of April, the diagnosis had darkened. The infection had spread beyond the ear, moving into the bloodstream. Septicemia, blood poisoning. The physicians did not use the word fatal, but they didn't need to. Those who had seen it before knew its pace, its certainty. She was moved to a quieter wing of the palace, her chambers darkened to ease her pounding head. Bowls of water with herbs were placed nearby to try to purify the air. Compresses were laid across her forehead, changed again and again as her fever refused to break. She asked for her family in England. Telegrams were sent, but the journey by ship and train would take days, and time was not on her side. Her condition worsened with unnerving speed. One evening, she tried to rise from bed and nearly collapsed, her legs unable to hold her. Her breathing grew shallow, her lips pale, her words slurring as though she had to pull each one from somewhere far away. The doctors conferred in low voices just outside her door. They spoke of draining the infection, of incisions and poultices, of hope in theoretical terms. But there was no hiding the truth. The crown princess was in mortal danger. Inside the room, the hours blurred. Sometimes she was lucid, asking after the children, requesting a cup of tea she would never touch. Other times she drifted into fevered murmurs, eyes half closed, whispering to people no one else could see. The palace was tense. Guards posted at her wing stood stiff and silent, their faces unreadable. Courtiers who passed through the corridors spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward the closed doors. And outside in the streets of Stockholm, life went on. Citizens went about their days, unaware that within the palace walls, the future queen was fighting for her life. There is an account, never published in her lifetime, from one of her ladies-in-waiting. She wrote of entering the room late one night to find Margaret awake but utterly still, her eyes fixed on the flicker of a candle. When she asked if the princess was in pain, Margaret replied, almost absently, "Only tired. So very tired." By the final day of April, her fever had risen dangerously high. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes clutching her abdomen as if to shield the child within her. The physicians stayed close, their expressions grave. The Archbishop of Uppsala was summoned quietly, just in case. In those final hours, the air in the room seemed suspended. Time moved differently. The ticking of the clock grew louder, the flicker of the candle slower, each shadow stretching across the walls. Outside the palace, rain began to fall, light at first, then steady, tapping against the windows as if marking the hours left. The doctors tried to keep her comfortable, though comfort was a relative term. Cold compresses, damp cloths for her lips, whispered reassurances that she was not alone. But sepsis is merciless. It creeps through the body with the patience of something inevitable, shutting down what it touches until there is nothing left to resist. By nightfall, the palace knew. Word traveled in soft footsteps and downcast eyes. The English rose was fading. Somewhere in another wing, her children were kept away from the sick room, shielded from the sight of their mother's decline. Her husband visited briefly, speaking low, his hand resting on hers. No one knows what words passed between them. The candlelight wavered. The clock ticked on, and the air in the room felt as though it was holding its breath. The next morning, the first day of May, the bells of Stockholm would remain silent. The dawn of May 1st came pale and cold, a sky washed in gray. Inside the palace, the corridors were unnervingly quiet. No rustle of gowns, no murmur of conversation, only the slow, deliberate footsteps of those who knew what was coming. Margaret's breathing had grown shallow during the night, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a little weaker than the last. She had slipped into unconsciousness some time before midnight and had not opened her eyes since. Her husband, Crown Prince Gustav Adolf, sat beside her, his hand over hers, feeling the coolness creep from her fingertips. He had been awake for hours, his gaze fixed on her face as if willing it to stir, to show the faintest sign of returning. The room smelled faintly of linen, candle wax, and something metallic that no one wanted to name. The doctors had done what they could, draining fluid, easing her fever. But the infection had moved too far, too fast. The child she carried could not be saved without risking the mother, and the mother could no longer be saved at all. It was the kind of medical impasse that left the room heavy with resignation. A priest entered quietly, robes brushing the floor, and began the final prayers in Swedish. Those in the room bowed their heads. Gustav kept his eyes on her, lips pressed thin, as the Latin phrases rose and fell like distant waves. At one point, a shaft of morning light slipped through the curtains, touching her hair. Even in illness, it gleamed faintly gold, just as it had when she had first stepped into this palace 15 years earlier, a bride from England with laughter in her voice. The sight made one of her ladies-in-waiting turn away, unable to watch. There was no moment of sudden drama, no gasp, no cry. Her breathing simply slowed until the pauses between grew too long to measure. And then, nothing. It was 2:30 in the morning. The English rose had withered in silence. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. The priest made the sign of the cross. The physician stepped back. Gustav sat motionless, still holding her hand, his thumb tracing the cool curve of her fingers. And then, as if on cue, the palace seemed to exhale. Footsteps moved quietly outside the chamber. Orders were murmured. Curtains drawn, candles snuffed, the news prepared for the court and the public. But within the room, time lingered. Her wedding ring was removed, polished, and placed on the bedside table. A nurse adjusted the sheet to cover her shoulders. The priest remained at her side for another prayer, this one for the unborn child whose heartbeat had gone still with hers. Outside, the rain from the night before had stopped, leaving the city washed clean. Stockholm slept on, unaware of the news that would soon break. By morning, the death notice would be drafted, written in formal, measured words that could never capture what had happened here. It would speak of an untimely passing, of deep sorrow, of national mourning. But it would not speak of the days of pain, the quiet decline, or the look in her eyes the last time she was awake. Half acceptance, half letting go. When the bells of the city finally tolled, their slow, deliberate rhythm rolled over the rooftops and across the waterways. In England, telegrams raced to royal residences, bringing the shock to her family. Queen Mary, her cousin, was said to have been deeply shaken. King George V ordered flags at half-mast. In Sweden, people gathered at churches, some bringing flowers, others simply standing in silence. They had known her as a warm presence at official events, a patron of causes, a bridge between nations. Few knew how much she had given of herself behind the scenes. Within the palace, her children were told gently, in words chosen to shield them from the finality of it. Gustav Adolf stood by as the governess spoke, his eyes fixed on the floor. One of the younger children asked when Mama would be back. No one answered. Her body lay in state for only a short time, draped in the Swedish royal colors and surrounded by white lilies. The scent was almost overwhelming in the still air of the chamber. Visitors came in measured lines, nobles, dignitaries, members of the court, each pausing briefly, bowing their heads, moving on. The woman who had once danced through the gardens of Sofia, who had painted watercolors on summer afternoons, who had carried the warmth of England into a colder court, was gone. The palace doors would soon close to prepare for the funeral. And the English Rose, who had lived and died far from the garden where she first bloomed, would take her place in the long line of royal figures remembered more for their titles than for the quiet human life behind them. In the weeks after her death, the palace corridors no longer echoed with the sound of her step. Her laughter, once a soft thread woven through receptions and family rooms, was gone, and in its absence, something else crept in. A hush that was not grief, but vacancy. The official mourning period was short. The royal calendar, already mapped months in advance, allowed little space for lingering sorrow. Diplomats still arrived. Receptions still took place. New political matters demanded attention. The world, as it always does, moved forward. But the signs of her erasure began almost immediately. Her portraits, which had hung in public spaces of the palace, were quietly taken down for preservation. The floral china set she had designed for state teas was placed into storage, replaced by more formal serviceware. Even the flowers she had insisted on for certain rooms, white roses in spring, foxgloves in summer, were no longer ordered. There were practical reasons for all of it, or so the household staff were told. But the effect was the same. Her presence, once so carefully maintained in the life of the court, began to dissolve. In the newspapers, the flood of obituaries gave way to the next wave of headlines. Her story, so vividly told in the first week, was reduced to a mention when the funeral date was announced, then to a brief note when it was over. Within a month, the press had shifted to covering the Crown Prince's public duties, now carried out without her at his side. For the children, life altered quietly but deeply. Their tutors spoke less of their mother as the days passed. Lessons resumed, routines re-established. The palace preferred not to stir emotions that might disrupt the appearance of order. Margaret's letters to them, which she had written during her travels, were boxed and placed in the family archives. The funeral itself had been restrained, almost austere by royal standards. She lay in a closed casket, partly due to her condition at death, covered with the Swedish flag and flanked by wreaths from both Swedish and British royals. The ceremony was conducted with dignity, but without the grandeur that might have drawn too much public sentiment. There was a sense that her memory was being honored, but also carefully contained. In England, there was some public outcry over her sudden death. Whispers about whether better medical care could have saved her. But in Sweden, such discussions were politely avoided. To question the circumstances would have been to question the monarchy itself, and that was not done. Even the places she had touched most, the gardens at Sofiero, the charitable projects she had supported, moved on under new patronage. Plaques with her name were quietly replaced or removed. In official records, her role was noted, but seldom expanded upon. It was as if she had been folded into history while still warm in the memory, smoothed away so that the lines of her life did not disturb the neat page of the royal narrative. Years later, when her children were grown, they would recall fragments. Her voice calling them in from the garden, the smell of her perfume, the way she bent over a sketchbook in the afternoons. But these were private memories, held close, rarely spoken aloud in public. For the nation, she became a photograph in an archive, a name in a genealogy, a brief note in a history book. Margaret Victoria Charlotte Augusta Nora, Crown Princess of Sweden, died May 1st, 1920. No mention of the toll of royal duty, no trace of the exhaustion behind her smile. The silence that followed her was not just the quiet after grief. It was the quiet of deliberate forgetting. A decision somewhere in the machinery of monarchy that her memory should be kept tidy, manageable, stripped of the human complexity that had defined her life. And so, the English rose faded, not because her story lacked beauty, but because beauty is fragile in the shadow of a crown. For decades, Margaret's name rarely passed the lips of those in power. The official histories of Sweden's monarchy noted her in measured, almost mechanical terms. The date of her marriage, the birth of her children, the date of her death. No more, no less. It might have stayed that way forever, had it not been for the survival of something small. In the late 1960s, a photographer cataloging the archives of Sofiero Palace came across a box marked simply MVCAN. Inside were dozens of glass negatives, images of a woman in soft light, her head tilted toward her children, her hands deep in the soil of a garden bed, her eyes catching the camera not with formality, but with warmth. The photographer had to look twice at the label before realizing whose face he was seeing. When a few of those images were published in a regional magazine, they startled those who remembered her name only faintly. This was not the distant, formal figure from official portraits. This was a woman laughing in the wind, with her hair slightly undone, kneeling to tie a child's shoe, leaning over a sketch with ink smudges on her fingers. It was, for a moment, as if the English rose had opened her petals again. The photograph spread quietly at first, shared among those with an interest in royal history. Then came the memoir. A retired lady-in-waiting, living in near obscurity, decided in her final years to write down her recollections. Not for scandal, but to give a voice to a good and gracious woman. Her pages were simple but vivid. Margaret sewing by lamplight for a charity auction. Margaret comforting a young maid dismissed without cause. Margaret sketching garden layouts and insisting the flowers be placed where they will make the old soldiers smile when they walk. It was not sensational enough to make headlines, but it was enough to stir something more enduring than gossip: affection. In the early 1980s, an exhibition on royal women at Sweden's National Museum included one of those candid portraits. Beneath it, a brief placard read, "Margaret of Connaught, Crown Princess of Sweden, 1882 to 1920, remembered for her elegance, her art, and her charity work." Visitors paused longer than expected at her photograph. Some tilted their heads, trying to reconcile the gentle smile before them with the knowledge that this woman had died so young and so far from her first home. Others leaned in closer, as if her eyes might reveal more than the words beneath them. For a brief time, she was spoken of again, not as a footnote, but as a person. Articles appeared in Sunday supplements, telling her story in softened tones. Garden clubs cited her work at Sofiero. A few of her watercolors, found in storage, were displayed under glass. And then, just as softly as she had returned, she faded again. The next generation of royal watchers moved on to other figures, other tragedies. The cycle of remembrance had given her a small revival, but it was not enough to anchor her permanently in public consciousness. Still, something had shifted. Among historians, her life was no longer entirely obscured. by the Crown's selective memory. There was now a record, fragile but present, of the woman behind the title. In a sense, that was her true resurrection, not in pageantry or public monuments, but in the quiet persistence of details, ink on her fingers, a wind-blown laugh, the bend of her back over a flower bed. These were the things that survived the decades of silence. And perhaps that was fitting. Margaret had never sought grandeur for herself. She had moved in the spaces between the spotlight and the shadows, finding her own ways to create beauty even when the role pressed heavily on her. Now, in the grainy silver of a century-old photograph, she was looking out again. Not as a crown princess, not as a royal figure, but as herself. It would not last forever. History rarely holds such moments for long. But for those who saw her then, the English rose bloomed once more. History remembers what it chooses. Sometimes that memory is fierce and unrelenting, chiseling names into stone. Sometimes it is soft and partial, keeping only what fits the narrative. And sometimes it is deliberate forgetting, polished silence, where a life once vivid is pared down to dates and titles. Margaret of Connaught lived in that fragile space between being remembered and being erased. She was a daughter of Britain, a wife to Sweden's future king, a mother to children who would carry her blood into the next century. She was the face in 1,000 photographs, the name in countless society columns. And yet, when her life ended at 38, when she died carrying the child who would never be born, her story began to narrow almost immediately, stripped of the parts that did not serve the smooth continuation of the monarchy. It is tempting to imagine that such a life, lived in palaces, must have been charmed. That beauty and privilege shielded her from the ordinary weight of existence. But the truth, what little survives of it, shows something more human. A woman who drew her own gardens, who worked with her hands, who carried the strain of duty in the lines at the edge of her smile. Her erasure was not dramatic. No accusations, no exile, no scandal to scrub away. It was the quieter kind, the one that happens when the machinery of public life moves forward and leaves the person behind. And that, in its way, is the more haunting. Because it forces us to ask, how many others have been smoothed out of history in this same way? How many lives, full of private courage and quiet artistry, have been trimmed to the barest bones so the official version remains untangled? Margaret's brief resurrection, through the rediscovery of photographs, through the memory of a single attendant, shows that even the smallest surviving details can breathe life back into the past. A face caught in laughter, a hand in the soil, an unfinished sketch. These can speak as loudly as titles and treaties if we allow ourselves to look closely. Today, her story does not appear in every book. She is not among the most studied queens or princesses, but she exists in the archives, in family trees, in the gardens that still grow where she once placed her plants, and in the mind of anyone who stumbles upon her photograph and wonders, who was she, really? We cannot change the way history handled her memory, but we can choose how we handle it now. We can resist the tidy erasure, let the complexity remain, and remember that behind every crown there is a human pulse, one that beats, breaks, and stops like any other. Margaret's life ended in the spring of 1920 in a palace overlooking water, under skies that were beginning to warm. Her name, for a time, drifted into silence. But the English rose, though withered, was never entirely gone. And if you remember her now, even for a moment, then she blooms again.